By the time his hand struck her face, the waiter was still pouring wine into the glass of the man beside her, not hers. He had gone around the table in a perfect silver circle, filling the glasses of bankers, ministers, husbands, chairmen, men with cufflinks that caught the candlelight like small sharpened teeth. When he reached Amara Vale, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if he had forgotten she existed, as if she were part of the linen, part of the arrangement, another pale, expensive thing placed there to soften the room. Then Julian hit her. It was not hard enough to throw her from the chair. That would have been too honest, too ugly, too undeniable. It was the kind of slap men like Julian delivered when they still believed they would be forgiven for it. Quick, flat, meant more to correct than to injure, meant to say not pain, but position. The sound did not ring. It landed dully beneath the music, beneath the clink of crystal and the slow breathing of people who suddenly wished very badly to become part of the wallpaper. Nobody spoke. The pianist in the corner missed half a note and recovered. Somewhere near the carved archway, a server froze with a tray of oysters balanced against his palm. The butter-yellow lights above the private dining room kept glowing with the same warm indifference, throwing gold across polished cutlery, over silk lapels, over the red mark beginning to surface on Amara's cheek. Julian's hand dropped back to his side. His jaw was tight, but his smile remained. That was the worst part. Not rage, not drunken collapse. Control. A man too practiced in performance to lose it completely. "I said," he repeated, his voice quiet enough to be mistaken for refinement. "Not tonight." As though she had embarrassed him, as though she were the disruption. Amara did not reach for her face. She did not flinch. She did not gasp the way a room wanted a woman to gasp when she had been publicly reduced. She sat very still, fingertips resting beside her plate, spine upright, shoulders loose beneath the black silk of her gown. Only the pulse in her throat betrayed her. That small, wild movement at the base of her neck, like something alive beating against locked glass. Across from her, one of Julian's investors lowered his eyes to the lamb on his plate. Beside him, a senator's wife adjusted her napkin, though it did not need adjusting. Julian's mother, immaculate in diamonds the size of apologies she had never made, took a sip of water and looked at the flowers. No one said her name. The room smelled of truffle butter, old money, chilled white wine, and the faint mineral scent of a coming storm pressing against the city outside. From 42 floors above Manhattan, the windows showed the river as a strip of black silk. In the reflection, the people at the table looked like a painting about power. In the painting, Amara had no mouth. Julian picked up his glass. He was already moving on. "That will be all," he told the waiter, though the man had not finished pouring. "And perhaps," he added with a soft laugh that invited complicity, "we can continue dinner without further confusion." A few people smiled, because cowards often borrow the expression of the strongest person in the room. Amara turned her head slowly and looked at Julian. Not with fury. Fury would have relieved him. Fury would have given him something familiar to fight. She looked at him as if she were finally seeing the exact measurements of a room she had lived in too long. Earlier that evening, he had told 3 different people that she didn't really do numbers. He had interrupted her twice when she answered questions addressed directly to her. When the trade minister from Lagos had recognized her surname and started to ask about the St. James ports, Julian had stepped in with a smile and said, "Her family has a lot of old holdings. Amara prefers philanthropy. Prefers. As though preference had anything to do with being erased. Her phone vibrated once against the satin fold of her clutch. Only once. A private vibration. A secured line. Nobody else heard it, but she felt it like a second heartbeat. Julian was saying something about expansion, about hospitality, about visionary leadership. The room had begun to breathe again, grateful for the permission. Forks lifted, glasses moved. Shame, once distributed among enough wealthy people, could pass for etiquette. Amara slid her hand into her lap and glanced at the screen. A single message. Final signature received. Close, confirmed. Below it, one line from her chief counsel. Meridian Aster transaction complete. $31 billion. Effective immediately. For a moment, the whole room changed shape. Not outwardly. The candles still burned. Julian still smiled. The waiter still stared at a point just beyond human failure. But inside Amara, something went cold and clear and bright. Not broken, not shattered, aligned. She locked the screen and set the phone face down beside her plate. Then she lifted her water glass with a steady hand, took one measured sip, and said the only thing she would say for the rest of the meal. "Please," she told the room softly, "don't stop on my account." And Julian, still unaware that his wife had just signed a $31 billion deal, smiled as if he had won. Amara had spent 11 years learning how wealth could be loud without ever being secure. Julian liked noise. He liked arrivals, flashbulbs, the soft panic of hostesses when his table wasn't ready, the way his name looked on black glass and brass. He liked being seen in doorways. He liked speaking over people with the confidence of a man who had rarely been made to pay the full price of his own mistakes. He called it presence. Amara had once mistaken it for certainty. When they met, he had been magnetic in the clean, dangerous way some men are before life tests them. He had a hotel group that was rising quickly, a face that magazines photographed well, and a habit of looking at her as if she were the only person in the room intelligent enough to bore him less than power did. In the beginning, she thought he saw her. Not her name, not her lineage. Her. That illusion lasted just long enough to become expensive. The St. James family had never been fashionable in the way Julian admired. They were older than fashion. Caribbean shipping, West African freight corridors, dry ports, data cables, energy storage, insurance. A quiet lattice of infrastructure that moved beneath headlines and made headlines possible. Amara's grandfather had taught her before she was 12 that people noticed yachts because they did not understand ports. Her mother, Celeste St. James, taught her that the most powerful rooms were often the ones with no cameras in them. Amara learned balance sheets before ballroom steps. She learned debt structures before she learned lipstick shades. She learned that silence was not the absence of power, only its storage. When Celeste died, Amara was 28 and already sharper than most men twice her age. She inherited not only wealth, but a philosophy. Never announce the roof while you are still laying the foundation. So while Julian built a public brand with rooftop bars and glossy interviews, Amara built Meridian quietly. She separated family sentiment from scalable assets. She modernized cold storage routes, moved capital into subsea cable infrastructure, took controlling positions in overlooked logistics hubs in Lagos, Bridgetown, Durban, Halifax, and Liverpool. She sat in rooms where people mistook courtesy for softness, and she let them. The first time Julian called one of her strategy meetings that charity board thing, she laughed. The 20th time, she did not. By then, a pattern had hardened between them. He performed, she stabilized. He expanded too quickly, she quietly repaired the damage. He signed aggressive leases, she refinanced them through intermediaries he never bothered to examine. He celebrated wins that existed mostly in press releases. She covered the liabilities that lived in footnotes. He liked telling people he had helped Amara come out of her shell. What he had actually done was become comfortable inside the shell he assumed she lived in. And Amara, for longer than she later forgave herself, let him. Not because she was weak, because women like Amara are trained from girlhood to distinguish between one humiliation that should be ignored and one that should end a life built beside someone. She understood markets faster than most, but even she had underestimated the way disrespect compounds. Not as a single wound, as erosion. A sentence here, an interruption there. A joke told at her expense and disguised as intimacy. A hand at the small of her back that guided too firmly. A correction in public. A dismissal at the table. A pattern so incremental it could masquerade as marriage until the day it couldn't. The dinner had been Julian's idea. Officially, it was a private gathering at the Crown Atelier, his flagship Manhattan hotel, to entertain board members, lenders, a trade delegation, and 2 possible rescue investors whose interest in Crossvale hospitality had become urgent after a brutal quarter. Unofficially, it was theater. Julian needed the room impressed, needed his image intact, needed everyone believing expansion was still a language he spoke fluently, not a cliff he had mistaken for a staircase. He had asked Amara to attend because certain kinds of money still trusted old names more than new charisma. And whether Julian admitted it or not, the St. James name opened doors even for men who claimed not to need it. That afternoon, she had not been with stylists or florists. She had been upstairs in a sealed conference suite with counsel in London, sovereign fund representatives dialing in from Abu Dhabi, and Astor Global's final signatory in Singapore. 12 screens, 3 jurisdictions, 2 decades of patient expansion crystallizing into one monumental transaction. Meridian Infrastructure's merger with Astor's transport grid network, creating a transatlantic logistics and digital backbone valued at $31 billion. It was the sort of deal that redrew maps. Julian knew there were some papers being finalized. He had asked once, carelessly, while knotting a tie. "Anything interesting?" "Very," she had answered. He kissed her cheek without looking up from his reflection. "Try not to work all evening. Tonight's about visibility." Visibility. The word stayed with her because of its insult, not its irony. At 7:40, she left the suite with signatures complete, her legal team already moving into implementation. At 7:55, she entered Julian's dining room, in black silk and diamond studs small enough not to frighten insecure people. At 8:18, he introduced her as my wife, who still refuses to retire into leisure, even though I keep telling her she's earned it. The men laughed. At 8:23, he spoke over her. At 8:29, he corrected her on a shipping corridor she owned. At 8:31, he slapped her. And still, through all of it, what unsettled Amara most was not the violence. It was the room's familiarity with it. Not the slap itself, perhaps, but the hierarchy behind it. the ancient social reflex that asked whether a woman had somehow caused the thing done to her. The frozen faces, the lowered eyes, the desperate appetite for smooth continuation. She had seen it before in gentler forms. Women erased from credit. Women used as insulation. Women expected to absorb the emotional weather of men who called themselves leaders. Tonight, the room had simply stopped pretending. By dessert, Julian was charming again. That was his talent. He could bruise and sparkle in the same hour. He spoke about Capri, Singapore, Riyadh. He made people laugh. He sold futures he had not secured. From time to time, his hand rested lightly behind Amara's chair, proprietary and casual, as though what had happened was a private correction too minor to disturb the architecture of evening. Amara let the hand remain there. Let him think proximity meant permission. Under the table, her phone filled with encrypted messages. Regulatory notice filed. Press embargo prepared for 11 a.m. Need confirmation on whether to proceed with Crown venue negotiation. She read each one without changing expression. Across the table, Julian's mother finally met her eyes. For one fleeting second, there was not sympathy there, but recognition. The older woman knew exactly what line had been crossed. She also knew, perhaps, that her son had misjudged the scale of the person sitting beside him. Amara gave her nothing. When the meal ended, Julian rose to thank everyone. The city glowed behind him. Crystal trembled lightly as staff cleared plates. He looked handsome, successful, unpunished. "Tomorrow," he said, lifting his glass, "begins a very significant chapter for us." Amara turned her wedding ring once around her finger. Tomorrow, she thought, it would. The elevator ride down from the private dining floor took 33 seconds. Julian spent 29 of them talking about himself. He stood beside Amara in the mirrored box, with his jacket unbuttoned, flushed with wine and approval, replaying the evening as men do when they believe the room has validated their version of reality. He mentioned the trade minister's interest, the lender from Zurich, the senator, the possibility of a Dubai expansion. He did not apologize. He did not even look at her cheek. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, he had convinced himself the slap was less an event than an edit. "I handled that," he said, smoothing his tie in the mirror. "You were starting to overcomplicate things." The doors opened. Marble, brass, arrangements of winter orchids, the soft drift of expensive perfume and climate-controlled air. Amara stepped out. Her heels made almost no sound on the polished floor. That was something she loved about true luxury. It swallowed evidence, noise, friction, consequence. Julian caught up to her near the revolving doors. "Don't do that." She turned. "Do what?" That silence. His smile remained fixed for the benefit of a couple entering from the street. Once they passed, his mouth flattened. "It's childish." There was a cold draft each time the doors turned, carrying in city rain and taxi exhaust. It touched the warm outline of her cheek like a reminder. "I see," she said. He exhaled, irritated by her calm. "Look, you know how these dinners are. The room has to stay aligned. You can't challenge me in front of investors and expect me to—" "Expect you to what?" He stopped. The question had no drama in it, which made it harder to dismiss. He glanced toward the concierge desk, then lowered his voice. "You made me look weak." Amara studied him. The immaculate grooming, the small strain beneath his eyes. The expensive watch purchased partly with liquidity she had once arranged. The man who mistook contradiction for disrespect because he had built his whole identity on being the loudest person in a room. "No," she said. "I didn't." His expression hardened. "I'm not doing this in the lobby." "Neither am I." She turned and walked toward the porte cochere where their car waited. He did not touch her again. Not there. Not in public view of cameras and valets and people whose opinions mattered. That, too, told her everything. The drive home passed through wet streets silvered by headlights. Manhattan looked rinsed clean, though nothing in it ever really was. Julian sat beside her in the back seat, typing aggressively into his phone, likely sending late messages to men who mistook confidence for solvency. Amara watched reflected red lights slide across the window like slow-moving wounds. At home, their penthouse was quiet, except for the distant hum of climate control and the low mechanical sigh of the city beneath the glass. Julian loosened his tie as he crossed the living room. "I have an early call," he said. "Let's not turn tonight into some melodrama." Amara removed her earrings and set them in a lacquer tray by the console. He mistook the gesture for surrender. "I'm serious," he added. "You know how pressure works. You know what I'm carrying." She looked at him then, fully, and the room seemed to sharpen around the edges. "I know exactly what you're carrying," she said. Something in her tone made him pause, only for a second. Then his pride came to the rescue, as it always did. "Good." He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey. "Then you'll understand why I need you on point for the next few days. We cannot have any emotional spectacle." Emotional spectacle. The phrase was so perfectly cruel in its blindness that Amara almost smiled. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Eli Thompson, her chief operating officer. She answered without asking permission. "Eli." His voice came through crisp, careful, awake with momentum. "We've initiated first stage notifications. Press holds till 11. Astor wants to confirm whether we're still evaluating Crown Atelier for the launch summit." Julian glanced over, mildly annoyed that she was taking business in front of him. Amara moved toward the window. Beyond the glass, the city burned in quiet grids. "We are," she said. "Understood. There's one complication." "Go on." Crossvale's bridge facility matures in 10 days. Their restructuring council has been circling our debt desk again through intermediaries. They don't know the holding companies are ours. Amara said nothing. Eli understood her silences better than most people understood language. "We can keep it clean," he said. "But after tonight, I thought you'd want clarity." She let her gaze settle on her own reflection in the window. Black silk, bare ears now, cheek no longer red, but no less marked for having cooled. "How exposed are they?" she asked. "More than publicly understood. If personal guarantees are withdrawn and the secondary line gets called, they won't make quarter close without asset sale or emergency governance action." Behind her, Julian laughed softly at something on his screen. The sound reached her like a door closing in another house. "Prepare the files," she said. A pause. "Everything?" Eli asked. "Yes." When she ended the call, Julian swirled the whiskey in his glass. "That your foundation?" "No." He took a sip. "Well, whatever it is, tomorrow I need you to be gracious." The board brunch, then the Linder walkthrough, then dinner with the Bahrain group. Keep things smooth. Amara slipped off her wedding ring and placed it beside her earrings. The faint metallic note it made against the tray was almost delicate. Julian stared at the tray, then at her hand. "What are you doing?" "Making things smooth." He set the glass down too hard. "Don't be ridiculous." "I'm not. It was one moment." She met his eyes. For the first time that evening, something like unease moved through him. He sensed a threshold, though not its size. "Amara," he said, lowering his voice into the tone men use when they want history to excuse them. "You know me." That, more than anything, settled her. "Yes," she thought, "I do." "I have an early morning," she said. "You should sleep." She walked past him and down the corridor toward her private dressing room, leaving him alone among curated furniture and city light, and the first real consequence he had felt all night. She did not sleep. From midnight until nearly 4, the apartment glowed in sectors. In her study, Amara changed into cream wool trousers and a cashmere wrap, tied her hair back, and sat at the long, dark desk she had paid for, but never claimed loudly enough as hers. Files opened across her secure screens. Corporate structures, debt ladders, venue options, voting agreements, liquidity maps. The mathematics of empire had always steadied her, because numbers did not bruise and then deny the bruise. At 1:15, she spoke with London counsel. At 1:40, with divorce counsel in New York. At 2:10, with governance advisors. At 2:45, Eli arrived in person, carrying a slate-gray document case. He had worked with Amara for 8 years and had seen her navigate hostile governments, unstable ports, and men whose handshakes had needed witnesses. He did not mention her face. He did not ask if she was certain. Respect, in his world, was often expressed through precision. He laid out the folders. Personal guarantee withdrawals here, venue transfer here, credit line exposure here, board notices here, and the morality clause file. Amara rested one palm on the desk. "How many know?" "Only those who must." He hesitated once, then said, "There are photographs from tonight." She looked up. "Staff phones?" "One already offered to a tabloid. Our people intercepted a copy through a fixer." "And?" "We can bury it if you want." The question hung between them. Amara thought of the room going silent, the lowered eyes, the relief with which dinner continued. She thought of all the women who had been told to protect a man's future with the shreds of their own dignity. "No," she said. "Hold it." "Don't release anything. But don't bury the truth to save him." Eli nodded. Near dawn, the city outside began to pale at the edges. Amara signed where she needed to sign. Withdrawal. Notice. Approval. Authorization. Her handwriting was elegant, unhurried. At 5:22, she closed the final folder. "By the time he wakes," Eli said carefully, "the architecture changes." Amara looked toward the first thin silver of morning. "It changed," she said, "at dinner." Julian woke late and angry. Not remorseful. Inconvenienced. He found Amara already dressed in dove gray, seated at the breakfast table with coffee untouched and a stack of papers arranged in clean, intimidating symmetry. Morning light moved over the marble island and across the city beyond, turning everything bright enough to expose what darkness had softened. For a second, he looked almost relieved to see her there. Still home. Still. Men like Julian were often comforted by a woman's continued physical presence. They mistook it for continued loyalty. "I told Nina to cancel the 9:30, he said, reaching for coffee. "I need time to reset the board." Amara said nothing. He poured, tasted, grimaced because it was no longer hot enough. "And I want last night forgotten. Completely. There are too many moving parts right now." She slid one of the papers toward him. He barely glanced at it. "What is this?" "Read." There was no sharpness in her voice, only order. He looked down with the irritation of a man asked to acknowledge logistics by someone he had assigned a decorative role. Then his expression changed. It was a notice. Formal. Legal. Precise. Withdrawal of personal guarantee. He read the first paragraph twice, then reached for the next page. And the next. "This is a joke." "No." "You can't do this today." "I already have." He let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Amara, be serious." "I am." He slapped the papers onto the table. "You think because you're angry, you can threaten me with paperwork?" "It isn't a threat." "Then what is it?" "A boundary." He stared at her as though the word itself were offensive. His phone began vibrating on the counter. Then again. Then again. He ignored it. "Do you have any idea what timing means right now?" he demanded. "Do you understand the message this sends if lenders hear?" "They will." He went still. Through the glass, a helicopter crossed the river in the distance, small and insect-like against the sky. "You wouldn't." Amara folded her hands. "You struck me in a room full of people and expected me to preserve your comfort by mourning. That was your mistake." His face flushed dark. "Do not weaponize one private incident." "Private?" She glanced at him for the first time with something colder than hurt. There were 18 witnesses. He looked away. The phone kept vibrating. Finally, he snatched it up. As he read, the last traces of condescension began to crack. A message from his CFO, then another from legal, another from Nina, another from a lender requesting urgent callback, another from his chairman asking why secondary facilities had been frozen. Julian looked at Amara as though she had altered gravity while he slept. "What have you done?" The question was almost childlike in its disbelief. She rose from the table. "I've stopped protecting a man who confuses my restraint with dependency." "Don't talk to me like that in my own house." Amara paused. Then, very softly, "Look around, Julian." The words landed harder than a shout. He did look. At the penthouse, the art, the view, the breakfast room suspended above the city like a kingdom. Perhaps for the first time in years, he saw not his taste reflected everywhere, but her money, her patience, her invisible underwriting of every polished surface he had called theirs and thought of as his. His pride rushed in to save him once more. "Fine," he said, jaw set. "You want to play this? Play it. But you'll regret embarrassing me when you realize what happens to you when I stop carrying your social weight." Amara almost pitied him then. Almost. Instead, she reached for a second envelope from the table and placed it in front of him. "What is this?" "Read it when your hands stop shaking." He hated that she had noticed. She walked toward the foyer. He followed. "Where are you going?" "To work."
You can't just leave a bomb in the kitchen and walk out. She took her coat from the stand. Black wool, minimal, exact. Watch me. His voice rose. Amara! She turned. For one suspended second, the old marriage seemed to gather itself in the doorway. Years of adaptation, swallowed objections, polished appearances, all the habits that had once made staying feel more civilized than leaving. Then he said the sentence that ended whatever faint mercy remained. You're nothing without the name I gave this city. The silence afterward was perfect. No traffic, no elevator chime, no staff moving in the background. Even the air seemed to withdraw and wait. Amara looked at him with an expression so calm it felt nearly sacred. Then she smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, simply with the settled certainty of someone who has heard the final line necessary to free her from confusion. You never gave me a name, she said. You borrowed one. She left him standing there with his phone lighting up his hand like a distress signal.
By noon, the consequences began to move in visible ways. The board brunch was abruptly postponed. 2 lenders demanded revised exposure disclosures. One gossip site ran a blind item about a luxury hotel prince facing domestic scandal and liquidity tremors. No names yet. But the city's upper circles had a way of understanding exactly who was being described long before lawyers could stop them. Julian spent the day in conference rooms trying to patch breaches he did not fully understand. Every time he reached for reassurance, something else had shifted. Lines he believed friendly had cooled. Intermediaries were unavailable. A family office that had flirted with rescue financing suddenly requested additional governance protections. His chairman wanted explanations. His mother called twice. He declined both. At 4 in the afternoon, he finally opened the second envelope. Inside was not an emotional letter, not a plea, not even divorce papers. It was the venue confirmation for the following day's Global Press Summit. Crown Atelier Grand Ballroom. Host entity, Meridian Astor Global Infrastructure. Executive Chair, Amara St. James. Beneath it, clipped neatly behind, was a memo from counsel regarding ownership structures he had never bothered to trace. Venue rights. Underlying lease interests. Debt positions. Service contracts. Proxies. By the time he reached the final page, he understood enough to feel sick. Not everything, just enough. That evening he called Amara 12 times. She answered none. At 7:43, he sent a message. We need to talk. Now. At 8:11. Whatever this is, stop before it gets ugly. At 8:26. You are overreacting. At 8:40. This damages both of us. At 9:12, stripped at last of vanity. Amara, please. She read every message from a quiet office at Meridian's temporary Manhattan suite, where 3 screens displayed media schedules, governance packets, and market responses to the leaked framework of the $31 billion transaction. Outside, rain moved slowly down the glass. Inside, Eli laid out the next morning's sequence. Opening remarks. Consortium statement. Board action. Security protocol. Press corridor. Once the announcement goes live, he said, there's no containing the overlap. His lenders will connect the debt positions within minutes. Amara nodded. Do you want him warned? She looked at Julian's last message, still glowing on her phone. Please. How easily that word arrived once discomfort visited him. No, she said. Then she placed the phone screen down, signed the final authorization for public release, and made her silent, final decision. Let him learn in public. Power, at its highest level, often sounded like ordinary admin. Not thunder. Clicks. Signatures. Elevators. Assistants saying good morning. The muffled glide of expensive shoes over carpet while the world rearranged itself in sealed packets and scheduled calls. At 6 the next morning, Amara entered Crown Atelier through the private service corridor rather than the marble front entrance. She preferred the back veins of beautiful buildings. You learned more from the mechanics than the chandeliers. Staff nodded as she passed, some with curiosity, some with sudden respect that had not been there 2 nights ago. Perhaps because rumors had already reached the kitchens before the papers reached the press. In the ballroom, crews were still dressing the stage. Meridian blue panels rose behind a polished lectern. Screens were being calibrated for market graphics and route maps. Florists adjusted white orchids and dark greenery that looked almost architectural. Rows of chairs waited beneath vaulted ceilings, painted in a muted gold that flattered anyone standing under it. This had always been Julian's favorite room in the hotel. He liked launching things here. Partnerships, menus, expansion fantasies. Today, it belonged to her. A venue manager hurried over, nervous, eager. Ms. St. James, the Astor delegation has arrived. Press security is set. We've also moved the family office principals to the East Salon as requested. Thank you, Amara said. She did not correct the woman's use of St. James instead of Vale. The correction had already become obsolete. In a smaller lounge nearby, her legal team reviewed final packets. Divorce counsel had separated the personal from the corporate with surgical care. Governance advisors refined language around the board action so that no one could accuse Meridian of hostile destabilization rather than prudent response. Eli, already on his 3rd espresso, handed Amara a slim folder. Timeline if you want it, he said, and the photography issue. She raised her eyes. The dinner image surfaced again. 2 outlets have it. They're holding for confirmation before publication. Amara opened the folder. The still was grainy, taken from the far end of the dining room. Julian's arm half extended. Her head turned slightly from impact. The room around them carefully not looking. It was uglier because of how ordinary it seemed. She closed the folder. No embargo, she said. No push either. If truth wants daylight, let it walk on its own. Eli nodded. He had seen powerful people spend fortunes to erase visible proof of what they were. He respected her more for refusing to spend dignity that way. At 8:10, Amara took a brief call from her grandmother's sister in Barbados, the only elder left who still called her by the childhood nickname, Mira. I heard a little storm is coming, the old woman said. Amara smiled faintly. A manageable one. Good. Rain washes filth toward the drain. There were women in Amara's family who never spoke loudly because they had not needed to. Their language had always been exact. After the call, Amara stood alone for a moment in the dressing suite prepared for keynote principals. A rail of untouched emergency wardrobe options lined one wall. A makeup artist waited discreetly by a mirror. On a side table sat a breakfast tray. Berries, tea, almond pastries, a silver pot catching window light. Amara dismissed everyone for 10 minutes. When the room was empty, she stood before the mirror and looked at herself. No dramatic swelling remained on her cheek. only the knowledge of it. Sometimes that was worse. Visible injuries forced the world to acknowledge sequence. Invisible ones invited debate. She touched nothing, changed nothing. Her face would go to the podium exactly as it was. The dress she had chosen was ivory, long-sleeved, structured at the shoulder, severe in the best possible way. Not bridal, not soft. It made no appeal. A pair of onyx earrings, a watch, no ring. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that fortunes were about to tilt. Meanwhile, Julian was still trying to stop gravity with phone calls. He arrived at Crown Atelier shortly after 8:30 through the main entrance, having ignored 3 suggestions from legal to stay away until facts were clearer. Pride had become his last remaining stimulant. Staff at the front desk greeted him with professional neutrality that he misread as normalcy. In the elevator, he barked at Nina over speakerphone about controlling access to the ballroom and making sure Meridian's people understood he had approval rights over any event tied to the property. He did not know yet that several of those rights were paper masks. His chairman called as he crossed the lobby. "I'm downstairs," Julian said. "I'll handle this directly." "Julian," the older man replied, voice tight. "You need to stop saying that." Julian slowed. "Excuse me?" "We received the packet." "What packet?" A pause heavy enough to become its own answer. "You really didn't know," the chairman said. Julian's chest tightened. "Know what?" "That your wife is not just hosting an event in your ballroom. She may be about to determine whether you continue as CEO. Impossible. "Then I suggest," the chairman said, with the cold exhaustion of a man tired of being surprised by avoidable fires. "You get impossible explained to you before the press does." The call ended. For the first time since the dinner, fear moved through Julian without being diluted by ego. Not the fear of scandal alone, the deeper kind. Structural fear. The fear of discovering that a wall you have leaned your whole life against was never yours, and may not even be a wall. He turned toward the ballroom level. Security stopped him politely. "I'm sorry, sir. Access is restricted pending credential verification." He stared at the guard in disbelief. "I own this hotel." The guard's face remained professionally blank. "One moment, please." That was when Julian finally saw the event signage mounted near the corridor. Meridian Astor Global Infrastructure New Era Announcement. Beneath it, on smaller type, Executive Chair, Amara St. James. No veil. No Mrs. No decorative title. Just the name he had spent years talking around as if it were inherited furniture. His phone rang again. This time it was his mother. He answered. "What have you done?" she asked. Julian looked at the sign, at the staff moving efficiently around a world in which he was becoming optional. "She's overplaying her hand." "No," his mother said quietly. "I think you never learned what hand she had." In the suite upstairs, Amara received the update without visible reaction. "He's here," Eli said. "Of course he is." "Do you want him admitted to the East Salon before press entry?" Amara took a sip of tea. Even now it tasted faintly of bergamot and steel. "Yes," she said. "Not to the ballroom. The salon." Eli studied her. "Private conversation?" "Brief." He understood. Not mercy. Placement. 15 minutes later, Julian entered the East Salon under escort. The room was quiet,
paneled in dark wood, with tall windows overlooking the river and a long table laid with carafes of water no one had touched. Morning light made every dust mote visible. There were no reporters, no audience. Only Amara standing near the window, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair. For a second, he only stared. Her composure enraged him because it was now indistinguishable from authority. "You set me up," he said. "No. You frozen lines, poisoned lenders, blocked access to my property, not your property." His mouth opened, then closed. He had come in blazing, but the room offered nothing for fire to feed on. No raised voice, no visible emotion. Only documentation already moving through the bloodstream of institutions. He stepped closer. "Whatever this spectacle is, end it. Now. We handle this privately."
Amara looked at him with a steadiness that made his skin feel too small. "You had your chance for private," she said. "You used it at dinner." The sentence left him briefly without language. Then came the last refuge of a man losing hierarchy. Contempt. "All this because I embarrassed you?" Amara's expression did not shift. "No," she said. "All this because you finally showed me what you thought I was worth." A knock sounded at the salon door. Eli, precise as a clock, opened it halfway. "2 minutes," he said. Julian's eyes flicked from Eli to Amara. For the first time, he understood not just that she had power, but that other competent people trusted it more than they had ever trusted his volume. He lowered his voice. "Amara, listen to me. If you do this publicly, there's no going back." At last, a tiny shadow of feeling crossed her face. Not hesitation, recognition. "I know," she said. Then she turned toward the door and left him standing in the room he could enter, but no longer command. By 10:58, the ballroom was full. Press risers along the back glinted with camera lenses. International financiers sat beside ministers, analysts, founders, and journalists who had smelled blood in the water but not yet identified whose. Assistants moved in narrow, controlled lines along the walls. Translation headsets waited at selected seats. On the giant screens, a map of interconnected ports, data corridors, rail nodes, and energy hubs pulsed in meridian blue. The room hummed with the specific electricity of important information not yet spoken aloud. Julian stood near the side entrance with 2 members of his legal team and the expression of a man determined to look central in a story that had already moved him to the margins. He had tried twice more to secure a private stop to the proceedings. He had failed twice more. The chairman of his board arrived without greeting him. A lender from Zurich avoided his eyes. One journalist glanced at him, then at her notes, with the sharp alertness of a predator recognizing a second headline. Then the screens dimmed. The room settled. Eli stepped to the lectern first, giving opening logistics with efficient calm. His voice was forgettable on purpose. The best operators often made themselves disappear so the architecture could take center stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "thank you for joining us. Today marks the formal announcement of the Meridian-Astor global infrastructure transaction and the next phase of strategic coordination across Atlantic, African, and Caribbean trade and digital networks." A ripple moved through the crowd. Pens lifted, phones angled. Julian's face changed. Not because he had not heard the words before, but because hearing them publicly made denial childish. Eli continued. "Please welcome Executive Chair of Meridian-Astor Global Infrastructure, Ms. Amara St. James. No applause at first. Just that inhale a room takes when it realizes it has misread a woman. Then Amara walked onto the stage. She did not hurry. Her ivory dress cut a clean line through the blue light. Her posture was effortless, not posed. She carried no notes in her hands, though a portfolio sat waiting on the lectern. The room, full of men who had spent years practicing visible authority, felt suddenly overfurnished by comparison. Julian stared as if he had never seen her before. Perhaps he had not. Amara reached the lectern and looked out over the audience. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence was not emptiness. It was command. It gathered the room into itself until even cameras seemed to quiet. When people discuss power, she began, they often describe what can be seen. Buildings, headlines, names on glass. But power rarely begins there. It begins in what others overlook. In routes they don't notice, labor they don't credit, infrastructure they assume will always hold because someone, somewhere, keeps holding it. Her voice was low and even, built for listening rather than applause. It traveled beautifully through the hall. For 20 years, Meridian has invested in the systems beneath visibility. Ports, storage, data, energy corridors. We built where others posed. We studied where others boasted. And today, in partnership with Aster Global, we formalize a $31 billion transaction that unites strategic assets across 4 regions and establishes one of the most resilient, independent infrastructure platforms in the market. This time the room did react. Not loudly. Wealthier rooms rarely are. But the stir was unmistakable. Analysts bent over devices. Journalists typed fast. A minister in the second row exchanged a look with his advisor. One camera cut briefly to Julian, caught him stiff and pale, then returned to the stage. Amara continued. This is not a vanity merger. It is an operating architecture designed for durability. It is also, for me, personal. I was taught by people who understood that dignity and structure have more in common than most realize. Both require foundations strong enough to bear weight without announcement. Julian shifted, unnerved by something in the line, though he could not yet see its destination. Then Amara opened the portfolio. Because transparency matters, there are several related disclosures to make this morning. The wording was so courteous, the danger in it arrived a second late. First, she said, Meridian-affiliated entities have, over time, acquired several secondary positions connected to Crossvale Hospitality, including portions of the bridge exposure currently under review. These positions were obtained lawfully, discreetly, and in response to repeated market instability. The room sharpened. At the side of the hall, Julian muttered, "No." One of his lawyers touched his sleeve. He shook him off. Amara didn't look at him. Second, after consultation with Governance Council, and in light of newly reviewed conduct and risk concerns, Meridian has declined any further support, direct or indirect, of executive instability within that organization. Conduct. The word moved through the ballroom like a blade pulled slowly from velvet. Several heads turned toward Julian now. Not many. Just enough. He took one step forward, as if proximity alone could rewrite sequence. Security adjusted without making the movement obvious. Amara's face remained composed. Third, she said, effective this morning, certain venue and operating rights concerning Crown Atelier have reverted under structures long in place but poorly understood in the market. So, for the avoidance of confusion, today's summit proceeds under our authority. There it was. Not shouted, not dramatized, merely placed where everyone intelligent could measure it. The journalists understood instantly. So did the lenders. So did the board members who had been receiving emergency packets all morning. The hotel prince did not fully own the palace from which he had been performing royalty. The quiet wife was not a dependent ornament, but an underlying force. The numbers connected. The social map redrew itself in real time. Julian stepped out from the sideline then, unable to tolerate invisibility 1 second longer. "This is absurd," he snapped, voice carrying farther than he intended. "You cannot hijack my company's relationships to stage some personal grievance." Every camera in the room found him. Amara turned her head. The entire ballroom seemed to lean into the angle of that motion. When she spoke, her voice did not rise. "This is not about a grievance." Julian laughed harshly, too loudly. "Then what is it? Revenge?" A beat. Then Amara answered with whisper-level thunder. "No," she said. "It is about consequence." Silence. There are moments when rooms decide, and the decision is irreversible. Not legally, spiritually, socially. The instant when people recognize who has been carrying weight and who has merely been standing on top of it. Amara let the silence settle before continuing. "I will not recount private matters for spectacle," she said. "But I will say this. No institution that depends on discipline, trust, and judgment can afford leadership that mistakes humiliation for authority. No partnership worth preserving is built on contempt. And no woman should be expected to finance, soften, or survive the ego of a man who believes her composure exists for his convenience." It was not a rant. That made it devastating. No names, no melodrama, no public crying to make the room comfortable in dismissing her as emotional. Only principle, spoken so calmly that anyone opposing it would have to oppose the principle itself. A reporter near the front raised a hand, but Eli subtly signaled to hold questions. Amara went on. "This morning, independent members of the Crossvale Board received a governance recommendation supported by financial review, risk exposure analysis, and documented conduct concerns. Their decisions are their own, but Meridian's position is final." Julian turned toward his chairman. "You knew?" The chairman did not answer from his seat. He simply removed his glasses and looked profoundly tired. Amara closed the portfolio. Then, for the first time since taking the stage, she looked directly at Julian, in full view of the room. Not with hatred, with truth. "You spent years introducing me as if I were adjacent to your work," she said. "As if patience meant absence. As if silence meant emptiness. You thought I was sitting quietly because I had nowhere else to stand." The words landed in the marrow of the room. Julian's face drained of color. "Amara." But there was nothing left in the syllables of her name that belonged to him. "I was standing on my own ground," she said. "You simply never noticed because it was holding yours." No one moved. A camera shutter clicked. Then another. Somewhere in the back, a journalist exhaled sharply, aware she was witnessing the kind of public reversal people later called inevitable, though it never feels inevitable while a woman is still swallowing the early insults. Eli returned to the lectern. "Thank you, Ms. St. James. We will now take questions on the transaction." It was masterful. The shift back to business denied Julian the chaotic scene he might have used as camouflage. There would be no screaming match, no viral brawl, No opportunity to frame the moment as a domestic dispute between equals. The room moved where actual power wanted it. To the deal, the numbers, the structure, the future she controlled. Questions flew. Can you outline integration priorities? What is the debt servicing strategy over the first 12 months? How exposed is Crown Atelier to cross-Vale governance action? Will the Atlantic Corridor expansion include Bridgetown Dataport investment? Amara answered each one with fluent precision. EBITDA alignment, regulatory sequencing, cold chain modernization, sovereign partnership criteria. She was formidable without flexing. Every reply made Julian smaller, not by attack, but by contrast. This was what competence looked like when it stopped apologizing for itself. Midway through the session, phones began lighting across the ballroom. The board vote had landed. Cross-Vale Hospitality announced an immediate leadership review. Julian Vale was placed on executive leave pending investigation into conduct and disclosure failures. The news spread row by row like a visible current. Julian saw it on another man's screen before he saw it on his own. For a brief, naked moment, he looked not powerful, not angry, not misunderstood, just frightened. Amara did not acknowledge the alert. She answered one final question about long-term infrastructure resilience, thanked the room, and stepped away from the lectern while flashes broke like cold weather around her. As she exited the stage, the crowd stood. Not everyone. Enough. And Julian, who had once silenced a room with a slap, now stood in that same world, hearing it rise for her. By afternoon, the city had chosen its version of the story, and for once, the chosen version was close to the truth. Financial media led with the deal. St. James closes $31 billion infrastructure merger. Business channels ran split screens of maps, valuation graphics, and still photographs from the summit in which Amara looked composed enough to unsettle entire boards. By evening, the second wave arrived. The grainy dinner image surfaced. Not through her office, not through a vindictive leak. It simply entered the bloodstream of the internet the way truth often does when too many people were present to keep pretending. The reaction was swift, cold, and beautifully unsentimental. Cross-Vale shares dipped. Sponsors requested review. A charity gala removed Julian's name from its honorary host list within hours. A lifestyle magazine that had once called the Vale's hospitality royalty quietly changed its online headline to Infrastructure Heiress and Estranged Husband. Social circles, always cowardly around descending men, developed sudden standards. Julian tried the usual responses first. Misunderstanding. Stress. Context. A difficult private moment unfairly sensationalized. The language collapsed on impact. No credible person wanted to be seen defending a man who had been filmed striking the same woman, now calmly outclassing him on every measurable axis. His old advantages, charm, polish, access, curdled under scrutiny. His board suspended him. His lenders tightened. 2 internal executives began cooperating with governance review in hopes of saving themselves. By the 3rd day, even his mother stopped calling to rescue him and began calling lawyers instead. Amara moved through the aftermath without spectacle. She relocated temporarily to the St. James townhouse on the Upper East Side, a quieter property she had kept in her own name and rarely used because Julian disliked old houses with opinions. The place smelled faintly of cedar, polished stone, and lilies the house manager changed every 2 days. Its silence was not hostile like the penthouse silence had become. It was protective. There, in rooms lined with books and family portraits that had never needed publicists, She handled what came next. Divorce filings, asset separation, security adjustments. A measured statement released through counsel, brief, dignified, unadorned. She confirmed separation, declined public commentary on personal matters, and reiterated her focus on Meridian Astor's operational launch. No tears for cameras, no revenge interview, no performance of damage for public consumption. That restraint made her larger. Messages arrived from women she had not spoken to in years. Some were old classmates. Some were executives from Lagos, Toronto, Kingston, London. Some were strangers routed through assistants and foundations. Short notes, sharp notes, thank you notes. The way you stood there mattered. You said what many of us never get to say. Thank you for not making dignity look loud. She read them late at night sometimes, not for validation, but for witness. The room at dinner had not named what happened. These women did. Julian, meanwhile, became smaller by the day. He moved into a suite at one of his remaining properties, then out of it when costs became politically ugly during review. He tried to force contact through lawyers, then through mutual friends, then through emotional memory. He sent one handwritten letter claiming he had been under unimaginable pressure. Another saying he had always believed in her brilliance, as if revision could operate retroactively on the bones of a marriage. She answered none. There was no redemption because redemption requires truth before regret. Julian wanted relief, not transformation. Within 2 weeks, the governance review uncovered enough aggressive disclosure practices and concealed risk layering to justify permanent removal. Not all of it criminal, some of it merely arrogant. But arrogance, once no longer subsidized by a competent woman's silence, has a way of looking exactly like incompetence. The board terminated him. His final public statement mentioned strategic differences. No one believed him. One evening, nearly a month after the dinner, Amara attended a private reception in Bridgetown tied to Meridian's port modernization program. The ocean beyond the terrace was dark and warm and breathing. Investors, engineers, and regional ministers moved through the space with the relaxed seriousness of people building something real. No one introduced her as someone's wife. No one asked her to smile more. No one told her to keep things smooth. A younger executive standing near the sea glanced at her and said, almost shyly, "I watched the summit twice." Amara lifted an eyebrow. "For the numbers?" The woman smiled. "For the stillness." Amara looked out toward the water. The trade winds moved the hem of her dress. Somewhere below, waves struck the rocks with patient force. Stillness, she thought, had always been mistaken for surrender by people who had never understood depth. Several months later, on a morning washed in pale gold, Amara stood alone on the terrace of her grandmother's old house above the Barbados coast and watched cargo vessels move across the horizon like deliberate thoughts. The house sat on high ground, where the wind came clean off the Atlantic and the shutters clicked softly when the breeze shifted. Down below, bougainvillea spilled over a stone wall in unapologetic color. Inside, breakfast had been laid and forgotten on a teak table because she had come out early and stayed. Dawn in that part of the world never arrived violently. It unfolded. Light touched sea. Sea touched stone. The day revealed itself without asking anyone's permission. Amara had come there after the quarter's final integration meetings, after the market had steadied around Meridian Astor, after the divorce entered its colder administrative phase, after the noise around Julian had finally become background. He still appeared now and then in articles about fallen founders, about governance failures, about men shocked to discover that women they dismissed had signatures worth more than their surnames. Each time, Amara felt less and less. Not numbness. Release. There is a difference. She had once believed victory would feel like impact, a dramatic pulse, a sudden emotional settling of accounts. Instead, it felt like quiet space returning to a room after a liar leaves it. The women in her family had always understood this. Respect was never applause. Respect was room to breathe, to think, to move through a doorway without being shrunk inside it. Dignity was not the moment the world finally recognized your value. It was the moment you stopped negotiating with people committed to misunderstanding it. Below the terrace, the sea flashed silver where the sun struck it. Beyond that lay routes her company now coordinated, ports she had helped modernize, cables humming with invisible traffic, refrigerated containers carrying medicine, grain, flowers, machine parts, all the ordinary necessities of other people's lives. That had always mattered more to her than headlines. Systems that held, structures that delivered, work that remained useful after attention moved on. Behind her, footsteps approached lightly over the old stone floor. It was her niece Zara, 19, bright-eyed, home from university for a short visit, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I guessed you'd be out here," Zara said. Amara accepted a cup. "You guessed correctly." They stood side by side for a while without speaking. The wind carried salt and hibiscus and the faint scent of coffee rising warm between them. Finally, Zara said, "Everyone talks about what happened like it was one moment. The dinner, the summit, the board. But I don't think that's true." Amara looked at her over the rim of the cup. "No?" Zara shook her head. "I think it was 1,000 moments. You just stopped swallowing them." The truth of it moved through Amara gently, not like a wound, like recognition. "Yes," she said. "That's closer." Zara studied the horizon, then asked, "Did it hurt? Winning, I mean?" Amara smiled faintly at the question, at its youth and its wisdom. "Yes," she said after a moment, "but not in the way people think. It hurt to understand how long I had mistaken endurance for love. It hurt to see clearly. Clarity often does." "And after?" Amara let her gaze rest on the ships again, on the clean, patient order of things moving exactly where they were meant to go. "After," she said, "it got quieter." That was the part no one ever wrote enough about. Not the humiliation, not even the reversal. The quiet after. The first dinner eaten without bracing for someone else's mood. The first room entered without calculating how much smaller to become. The first morning when your own name feels complete in your mouth. The first silence that protects instead of punishes. Below them, a gull tipped sideways in the wind and righted itself effortlessly. Zara leaned her elbows on the terrace wall. "Do you think he ever understood?" Amara thought of Julian then only as one thinks of a storm once past, by the damage measured, not the thunder remembered. A man who believed public volume could replace inner substance. A man who placed his hand where respect should have been, and lost everything that hand could not hold. "No," she said. "I think he understood loss. That isn't the same thing." The shutters clicked softly again behind them. Somewhere inside the house, a clock marked the hour with a mellow chime. The day had fully opened now. Staff voices drifted faintly from the kitchen. The world was moving. Ships, markets, weather, lives. Amara set her empty cup down on the stone railing and closed her eyes for one brief second, letting the wind touch her face without memory attached to it. When she opened them, the horizon was still there, wide, unapologetic, entirely hers to meet without fear. And that, more than the billions, more than the ballroom, more than the moment a room finally learned her worth, was the real victory. Not that she had watched a man fall, but that she had risen so calmly, he never understood he was already beneath her. And out over the water, where the morning light turned everything it touched into something clearer, Amara St. James stood in the life she had built with her own hands, and did not make herself smaller for anyone again.